In this presentation, we'll continue our discussion about classification of attributes as part of entity modeling. In the previous topics, we discussed about the classification of attributes in simple and composite attributes based on the structure of the values for the attribute, and in single value and multi-value attributes based on the number of values for a given entity instance. In this topic, we look if the attribute must have a value for each entity instance and will classify them in required attributes if they must have a value for each entity instance, and optional attributes if there might be entity instances with no value for this attribute. Let us consider the following example that models brief information about available cars for sale by Toyota. We assume that the image shows representative entity instances covering all possible cases. The name of the entity is model. We'll identify and discuss all the attributes involved. The attribute power appears at the top of each car description and may have values like hybrid, plug-in hybrid, hybrid available, or may be missing. For instance, Corolla hatchback does not have a value for this attribute. Such attributes are named optional because there are or might be entity instances with no value for it. The attribute node appears under the picture in red, and for one of the car has a value first ever. Because there are several entity instances without a value, this is another example of optional attribute. The attribute year has a value 2020 for all shown cars. Each entity instance must have specified the year of the model. Therefore, this is a required attribute. Let us define more formally what is a required attribute. A required attribute is an attribute that must have a value for all entity instances. This must be true not only for the already defined entity instances, but also for the entity instances that will be defined in the future. Therefore, to decide if an attribute is required, one must consider all hypothetical situations that might appear. The abbreviation for a required attribute is either REC from required or NN from not null, expressing that the attribute must have a value. So it does not have a null value. Null is a conventional value when an attribute has no value. Let us consider a few more examples of required attributes marked with REC or NN. The first name of a person, for instance John or Jane, is a required attribute because any person must have a first name. The price of a car, for instance 32,497 or 27,520, is a required attribute for the entity car because all cars will have a price. The name of a city, for instance Fairfax or Vienna, is a required attribute for the entity city because a given city has always a name. The height of a mountain, for instance 4,397 feet or 4,383 feet, is a required attribute for the entity mountain because a mountain has always a highest peak. The color of a paint, for instance blue or red, is a required attribute for the entity paint because a paint must have a color. The abbreviation for the name of a state, like VA or MD, is a required attribute for the entity state because all states have an abbreviation. In all these examples, the attribute has a value for all entity instances currently defined or that will be created in the future. Let us define more formally what is an optional attribute. An optional attribute is an attribute that may not have a value for some entity instances. This might not be true for the already defined entity instances, but may be true for some entity instances that will be defined in the future. Therefore, to decide if an attribute is optional, one must consider some current or hypothetical situations in the future when the attribute has no value. The abbreviation for a required attribute for an optional attribute is opt or null, from null value. Null is a conventional value when an attribute has no value. Let us consider a few more examples of optional attributes, marked with opt or null. A person may have a middle name, for instance Mary or Anne, or may not have a middle name. Therefore, middle name is an optional attribute for a person. An address may contain an apartment number like 167, or not if it is a house. So apartment is an example of an optional attribute. A book may be part of a series like Harry Potter, or not. Series is also an example of an optional attribute. A course may have a prerequisite like IT 104, or may have no prerequisite course. So prerequisite is another example of optional attribute. A car may have a towing capacity like 3,500 pounds, or may not be allowed to tow. Therefore, tow capacity is another example of optional attribute. In all these examples, at least for one entity instance, an attribute may not have a value. This is the reason for which all these attributes are optional, marked with opt or null. We'll continue the case study started at the beginning of this presentation. The attribute name of the model has the values Corolla, Prius, and Avalon. This is another required attribute because each car must have a model name. The attribute style of the model specifies a style of the car to some entity instances like hybrid, hatchback, or prime. However, Avalon does not have a style specified. Therefore, this is another optional attribute. The attribute file name specifies the file name of the shown picture for each of the cars. Each car model has a picture. Therefore, the file name is a required attribute. The attribute starting price and featured price are specified for each and every model. Therefore, both are required. The last attribute, mile per gallon (mpg), is also present for all the cars. So this is another required attribute. Looking at the entity instances table for the attribute helps in identifying if an attribute is optional or required. In this presentation, we discuss about required attributes that always have a value for all entity instances and optional attributes that may not have a value for some entity instances. You may continue to watch the next section in the attribute classification topic, unique and duplicated value attributes. If you like this video, please subscribe to my channel. Thank you for watching. It is optional to completely watch all the videos, but is required to learn their content.